So in the previous module, we introduced the idea of performatives. And the basic idea here is that we could divide all kinds of language into two groups, that there are constative utterances that say something and they're true or false, and there are performative utterances that do something and they're not true or false, but they work or they don't work. Now, there was a lot of interesting discussion of this idea back a long time ago, but ultimately there were a lot of problems with it. So in this module, we will see some examples of a few of those problems. So one of the big problems is that performatives often don't do the thing that they look like they should be doing. Right? So for example, if I say something like, if you don't shut up, I promise I will come over there and hit you. On the surface, that looks like it's a promise, right? But the action that it's performing, it's not really promising, right? What it's really doing is threatening or warning or trying to make someone stop doing something, right? So the problem here is that we don't have a clear way to identify what a performative is or what a performative is doing, right? If it looks like it's promising, but actually in real life, what it's doing is not promising, but it's doing something else. Another problem we have is that performatives are not the only kind of language that can do something, right? So think about these sentences. One is it raining? And the other one is, I hereby ask you if it is raining. Now, actually, only the second one of these sentences looks like it's a performative, right? Because the second one is language that's doing something, right? You're using that language to make a question. But actually, both of these sentences accomplish the same thing. Both of them do the same thing. Right? Both of these sentences can be used to ask a question, even though only one of them sort of has the typical features of a performative. So this is another problem with the division between performatives and constatives, right? That we can't really say performatives are the only kind of utterance that does things, because we can find lots of examples of other utterances that don't look like performatives, but they still do things. And the last challenge that we'll talk about here is that performatives are not the only kind of utterances that can not work or can be infelicitous. Right? Remember, thinking back to the previous module, we said that a difference between constatives and performatives is constatives can be true or false, and performatives can work or not work. But in reality, actually, constatives could also work or not work. So to take one example, if I ask you a question, are all of John's kids boys? But in reality, John doesn't have any kids, then this question doesn't make sense. Right? So in fact, you might not even answer the question with yes or no. The most likely way that you would answer this question is to say, that question doesn't make sense because John doesn't have kids. Right? So this is an example of an utterance that is not a performative, but it's infelicitous or it doesn't work, just the same way that performative cannot work. Right? So in a way, asking, are all of John's kids boys when John doesn't actually have kids? It's kind of like saying, I name this ship the Rocinante when there's not a ship there that I can name, or when I don't have the authority to name a ship, right? Both of these are examples of utterances that don't work because they don't meet some kind of important conditions, right? So these are several examples that challenge the idea of a clear division between performatives and constatives. And in the module online, there's another example, but it's much more detailed, so we won't talk about it in this video. But the bottom line from these examples is that we don't really have a clear way to tell the difference between what is a performative and what is a constative. And in fact, it seems like most utterances have features of both, right? So the same utterance can say something and can do something, and it has the features of a constative and the features of a performative. So ultimately, the idea of performatives basically fell apart. It was a very interesting idea, but people recognized that it couldn't be supported. So no one really talks about performatives anymore, but from the process of thinking about performatives and how they work, we learn something new about language, which is that language is not just about saying something that's true or false. It's not just about spreading a message. It can be about doing things or accomplishing things. So in the next module, we're going to try to wrap these concepts up all together and see what we can learn from the idea of performatives and how we can integrate this with what we know about how the rest of language works.